All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here and joining us for our Introduction to Municipal Readiness for Public Area Mobile Robots. This is our second webinar, an opportunity to introduce all stakeholders, whether you're in a municipal government or a technology company, accessibility advocate, researcher, or urban planner. So thank you for being here. I'm going to ask Bern to take us through this in terms of our welcome today. Just a little bit about the Urban Robotics Foundation. We are working at the intersection of urban space, accessibility, and mobile robots. Our driving force is to anticipate how public area mobile robots will impact the city systems and its people. And we are creating guides, draft international standards, and hosting events like these to help share that. We are a global nonprofit and we are membership funded. We believe that to prepare cities and the technology partners involved, we need well-constructed standards, consistent governance, and standards-based design. That will lead to greater accessibility and safety for everyone, higher acceptance overall, and better cities and livability. So in terms of our agenda for today, I'm going to hand it over to Bern to let us know how it's going to go and to welcome our guest speaker, Stephanie.
Thank you. So welcome, everyone. Just as I read out the agenda, I just came away from a 3-day trade show at which we had one of our members' robots, and we met something on the order of 75 or 80 city councilors from around the country of Canada. And what was interesting is that they were very interested in general, very interested in the robot, and many fewer of them were interested in things such as standards and the like. And it took a few minutes for them to see that it was going to be necessary to have standards and guidance and, how it is that we ought to prepare ourselves for these. It took a few minutes for most of the counselors to sort of twig into that. And of course they did after a short while. So I think what's good for today is that as we, toward the middle of today's session, our guest speaker, Stephanie Duck from DDoT, Washington City Department of Transportation, is going to talk to us a little bit about their experience, and that's very, very germane to standards and preparations and regulations and so forth. So the agenda altogether, I'm going to talk about what are public area mobile robots. The standard calls them PMRs. Stephanie is going to talk about PDDs, which is personal delivery devices, which is one kind of PMR. So PMR is a full set of robots, and PDDs is one kind of them. I'm going to talk momentarily about some of the reasons for growth in this industry or in this technology, its challenges. Again, the standards themselves. We're going to stop and listen to what Stephanie's experience is. And I'm going to return and talk about the municipal guide for public area mobile robots and then have a Q&A after that. So here's the definition of public area mobile robots. They are ground-based, so not drones and not in the water, but on the ground. It doesn't matter whether they have wheels or legs. Almost all of them have wheels now. Legs are coming, but that's mostly experimental at this point. They don't have an operator directly with them. So we say they're unmanned or uncrewed. They are often teleoperated, at least lightly or heavily, but in other words, any human attendance is at a distance. What's key is that they're operating in public pedestrianized spaces, public spaces. It could be indoors like hospital and airports, outdoors like bikeways and walkways and sidewalks. But they're not, this is not, not mines and farms and so on, but it's in the public. The tasks that these are performing are delivery and maintenance, surveillance, monitoring, any sort of task that can be roboticized. And there's many, many tasks that we're working on roboticizing that operate in this public shared space. Just to make sure we understand what's not in scope. So we're not talking about industrial and manufacturing robots, which we hear a lot about. We know that the Amazon warehouse is full of robots and many factories are full of robots and so forth. We're not talking about those, farms, etc. We're not talking about aerial drones. When we talk about delivery, we know it's possible to deliver by aerial drone. We're not talking about those. And it's also the case that they're often thought in the same class as electric scooters and e-bikes. Those have human operators, so those are not included in this class of devices. So very briefly, there's a lot of drivers. There's an increase in consumption, same hour, same day, last mile delivery. And there's a labor shortage around that, which drives the demand for robots. E-commerce is the same thing, the same sort of increased consumption through e-commerce is driving the demand for robotic, in this case, delivery. We're talking about this is just about delivery. Of course, innovation, anytime you have innovation, then the innovators say, what can we use this for, and so forth. So that drives demand as well. And we're looking to reduce costs. And look in the bottom center, there's many cities with an aging population. That aging population needs help. They need more delivery, for example, or they need more services, for example. And there's fewer people in those that at labor age in those aging populations. So all of these things all together, we don't need to study them, but all of these things all together are driving the demand and innovation and interest in these robotics. Now, very clear to understand the challenge. So on the left is a structured environment, and we are not concerned about those, but there is it's much easier to operate robots in a structured environment. The floor is clean and level. The everything in the environment is organized to a high degree. Whereas when you go out on the street, this is an extreme example, but I'm sure all of you have been on streets where the sidewalk is a little bit impassable for some reason or other. I have many images of in my city on garbage collection day, and the sidewalks are impassable on those days and so forth. So this is the challenge of the unstructured environment. Do we want robots to operate in that environment? If we do, what do we do about that and so forth? So those are the kinds of things that we might be concerned about. So these are a whole series of images. These are from my city of Toronto. You can see on that there's things blocking the side. The one this is from Lisbon. This is from Lisbon. And so it's not just, we're not the only ones that don't know how to drive. This happens, well, don't know how to park, I should say. That's a parking violation. At least in my city, that's a parking violation. But in any case, you can start to see some of the barriers. This is in the city of Toronto, garbage night. This is in the city of Toronto, construction. And you can see that's a very narrow passage and so forth. So I'm just showing you the kinds of things that would be a barrier to operation that we might want to consider how to avoid those or how to manage those and so forth. Here's a very interesting case where the building, this is a museum in the city of Toronto, and the building is designed with this handrails jutting out into the sidewalk. I've actually injured myself on those. I was watching my phone, and I hurt myself on those. And any robot that doesn't see those would have its flag clipped off, for example. This is the same scene from the other direction on the right. So all of these kinds of environments are of concern. How do we map them? How do we manage them, and so on? Here's a case. This is in a city in California. This robot that you see on the left had a failure of some kind. I don't know what the failure was. This is a candid film that we took, and this is a frame from that film. And in that failure, I'm just going to guess it had a bad electrical failure, but I don't know that. But it had a failure, and it was stalled on the crosswalk at the early part of the crosswalk, and it stayed there for about 5 or 6 traffic lights. And you'll see way in the distance, another vehicle from the same company came to rescue it. And this is the second vehicle trying to push the first vehicle out of the way. Now a pedestrian is trying to help. Consider the problem of a pedestrian helping a robot. What about the insurance? This is a good Samaritan trying to help out, and what's our regulations about that? Is that ought that to be permitted? And if that person is harmed, is the city liable or not? How does the city protect itself from that? And so on. You can start to imagine, where does the city want to speak up or not speak up or do, and so forth. A second pedestrian came to help. Finally, they were pushed. Now look where they're stored. They're stored on the ramp for the accessibility ramp for wheelchairs. They stayed there for a few more lights, and the worker that worked there for that company came to take the disabled robot away. And so this entire sequence lasted about 12 to 14 minutes. What about circumstances like this? How does it? What does the city have regulations about this sort of thing. Obviously, mishaps happen. So as it sat there, interestingly enough, now look where it is relative to that ramp. A pedestrian stepped up to get onto the sidewalk. That's fine because this particular pedestrian was able to do that. What if that pedestrian was in a wheelchair? Now that's happened before. There was a case in Pittsburgh where such a robot was blocking the ramp and a person came up to that ramp and couldn't mount the ramp and had to mount the curb with her wheelchair and complained. How does that work? And so forth. So this is just evidence that we don't really quite have all of our regulations in place, and we don't have all of our systems in place to do this at scale. I mean, this is a company that just has, I don't know what, 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 robots. What happens when this reaches scale? Here's that same robot finally, after a few more lights, decide to cross that same crosswalk that we've been looking at. Now look on that there's a car turning right that's blocked the way. And if you look in the left corner, you can see the beginnings of a car coming on to turn. So that robot can't turn around and go back because it's going to get hit by the car that's turning right at the bottom left. It can't go straight without exiting this crosswalk, which it did. It left the crosswalk and went out into what would be either, it could be the bicycle lane. In this city, in this intersection, it's not the bicycle lane, but that could have blocked cyclists. And so you can start to see all the conflicts between cycling, crosswalks, pedestrians, and so on, all these things. So new subject, what we want to do in the municipal guide or in the standards that we're working on is to ask ourselves some questions. Do we want these robots to act in a very shy fashion, to pull away and stand behind and wait until nothing else is happening? Do we want them to line up in an orderly fashion? You can start to see problems here. Do you allow them to be congested? Do you constrain the number that are permitted at any one location? Or do you even allow them to act in a competitive manner amongst themselves? These are all the kinds of outcomes that can occur in a sort of, if you set guidelines for them to be shy or orderly, or if you don't set guidelines and allow them to be congested and competitive. How do we define and manage these kinds of circumstances? Now, this is a disturbing picture. I took this picture about 1.5 years ago because I'm looking for instances of things we need to really look out for. So this person has a disorder that is called kyphosis that has them not be able to stand up straight and look ahead. So there's a mobility disability. She's walking, but ambling slow. And there's also a visual disability in that she can only see maybe 1 or 2 meters in front of her. She can't see out what's happening much more than that. So, if a PMR arrives, will it frighten this person? Or will it block her path? Or on the other hand, perhaps we could deliver groceries for her. There's actually a PMR that follows such a person. Well, a person from one of those companies is on this call. Such a PMR could be loaded and follow her to take her groceries to her home instead of her having to drag her cart. For example, that's the Follow Me robot. It's actually possible to imagine, they don't exist yet, but you could imagine a robot being protective of her. So that's also, so there's a lot of possibilities all the way from the negative to the positive. My question is, do we understand all those things, and how do we make sure those approaches are taken? So briefly, why URF was founded. We believe that public area mobile robots will become a significant player in many cities, but it's not just delivery, but all sorts of maintenance activities, snow removal, lawn mowing, and so on. And when lawn mowing doesn't sound like pedestrianized, but if you're going to mow lawn in a park and there's people in the park enjoying the park, that is a pedestrianized area. So all forms of robotics that share that space with vulnerable users. We also think, and you saw me hint in a couple of places, there's a huge number of advantages. And we don't think we're going to reach those advantages unless we have standards to help us reach those. We think international standards are the best because that helps manufacturers and operators. And also, if there's international standards, cities need something to look toward as they are developing their own bylaws. the other side of that is, if we don't do anything, if we just let this go laissez-faire, I feel confident that pedestrians will be worse off if that were to occur. And for that reason, we actually think that some of the deployment standards are at least as critical as safety standards. Deployment meaning the behavior, the orchestration, those kinds of things. If they're not cared for, they will become even more problematic than safety issues, or at least as problematic. Anyway, lastly, we're optimists, and we think that we can make a positive contribution and help this, primarily accessibility, cities, and the industry themselves, planners in the industry themselves, to have this be a better circumstance. So who are all of our members all together? Obviously, municipality and accessibility planners, technology companies. A couple of our members, one of our members is a traffic company managing the walk signals, because we only want a robot to cross an intersection with a walk signal. We don't want it to cross, obviously not a red, but if you don't, in some intersections, if you don't push the so-called beg button, then you don't get a walk signal. That has traffic implications. So we want that walk signal to be available. And there's more than one company working on that problem. We're also concerned that fleet operators who might be operating large fleets eventually at some point subscribe to these standards as well. And of course, there's a lot of people researching this. So we have researcher members as well. So some of the benefits of membership are that you are prepared, that you anticipate. So your city or your planner or your traffic company, whatever you represent, that you are anticipating what's the impact of public area mobile robots, and that you start to think about that for, again, for your city or your company or your business. You are also, as a member, able to actually shape the standards. You look at what's missing in every meeting we have. Somebody said, did you think about this? Did you think about that? And I've never come away from a meeting without learning something new that needs to be in that standards. Very, very valuable process that people engage in those meetings. And importantly to each of you is that you network with each other. It's a very important aspect as well. We have recently introduced one of our robotics members to one of our planner members, and they are looking together at a pilot. We step out at that. We introduce people, but we step away from any of the conversations or meetings because we are agnostic as to which machines or which project or which pilot. We're simply here to have people collaborate. So in the actual draft aspect that we're preparing, it includes things about data, curb preparation, walkway, like sidewalk preparation and so forth, the actual behavior of the devices. I gave you some examples earlier about how they might gather at intersections and so forth, how safe they are at locations. One of the things that we demand is no matter where a robot is, it is never possible to get lost. A robot can have a failure. It can't be unless it's stolen, but it can't get lost. The way the standard is designed, it's not possible to get lost, even if it's total failure and total communication failure is still locatable. That standard covers that sort of thing. Concerned absolutely about bystander safety. There's no way we want somebody who's simply using the sidewalk, walking their dog or walking their child or carrying their groceries to be alarmed or to be upset or displaced or have to jump out of the way or any of those things. We don't want any of that happening to the bystanders. All sorts of issues about map maintenance, because sidewalks are very dynamic environments. Shopkeepers put signs out, change things frequently. So it's not just that other people are there, but there's, garbage cans get moved, newspaper boxes get moved, garbage cans get tipped over sometimes by vandals and so forth. So how do we keep those environments, quite up to date and so forth? The Journey Data Recorder is really all about understanding misbehaviors if they occur so that we improve the software, and also very, very critically for insurance subrogation. In case something does happen, there is no system that's perfect. If something does happen, then what happened? Do we understand? And how can we assign liability and so forth? A lot of things like that. So I want to take a break. I want to introduce Stephanie Dock with the DDoT, with the District Department of Transportation in Washington, D.C. I'm going to stop now, Stephanie, and let you take over, please.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to, as Bern said, be talking about the District Department of Transportation, personal delivery devices in DC. So Bern, next slide. You can hit next. Yeah, just so there we go. Just a bit of context. We're Washington, DC. I admit I didn't put a map up. I think you probably have a good sense of where we are. Just because we are the nation's capital for the United States, but we're also home to about 700,000 residents. And that makes us, we get on the center stage a lot for the people that are operating in a very small part of the district. And then there's everything else that happens in the city. And DDoT is a really interesting entity in the way, and we're written into the Constitution. We are not a state currently, and so we are actually essentially responsible for everything within our borders with a few limits. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight just the breadth of what this agency deals with. For those in the states, we're a city, county, and state DOT, all in Department of Transportation, all in one. And those outside, it just means that there's, except for kind of interstate commerce and large federal funding, we control everything that happens between the building lines. We're also a little bit unique. In that we really do control almost everything that happens between the building lines. Street trees are amongst our agency's responsibility. There's 144,000 of them, and our foresters know exactly where they are. We also do all of the parking, the curb, kind of the different curbside uses, the sidewalk cafes. And now we've entered into the space of autonomy and are dealing with the testing for autonomous vehicles. That's within my program area. Personal delivery devices, as I'll be talking about today. We're also standing up a drone program for agency use. DC is mostly a no drone zone for the aerial drones, but for government uses, we can fly them for things like inspecting assets. But we have a lot of within our span of control, and which is helpful. So I'm not negotiating with state legislators. It's just the people downtown. And there's 13 of them. So it's a little bit of a more controlled situation, though we certainly do get a lot of interest on the more national side because people can see these in their backyard. So next slide. So personal delivery devices in the district. They were originally authorized with pilot legislation in 2016, and then a permanent program was established by our council in 2018. The program is housed within the District Department of Transportation, and the focus is really on the permitting of commercial fleets. But kind of paired with that, we're starting to contemplate what we would do with public sector uses. So as Bern mentioned, we're a kind of a particular and narrower focus of what these types of robots could do. We haven't really dealt much with the question of what if someone owns their own device, and what would that mean? There are quite a few parameters legislated into the 2018 legislation. So they're limited to sidewalks and crosswalks, and they set a weight and a speed limit within that legislation. So the unladen device is not supposed to weigh more than 90 pounds, which at the moment does keep several of the operators in this space from the district because their base weight of their vehicle is too heavy. That is something that we cannot change. But next slide. What we can do is we'll write the regulations that put more meat on the bones about what the devices can do. The legislation kind of sets the framework, identifies some key characteristics, and the regulations are where we as the agency with the technical staff get to define a little bit more of what is done. This isn't really our first go at something of this type, the specific nature of a mobile robot, certainly, but we've learned a lot, I think, about what's being done on the sidewalks, bike share, scooter share. Both we are partial owners and run the operations or manage the contract that runs the operations for our docked bike share system. We also have a number of e-bike and scooter share operators that are on an undocked arrangement, the dockless framework. We also have car share in a couple different forms. We've had moped sharing, and then we have our general occupancy permit kind of structure that we're working in. So we're not starting from nothing. We're trying to work within the legislation, but also some of the lessons learned from those programs about some of the basics of how do you issue a permit to these groups, what are the materials that we need to require, but also what are some of the things that we would prefer not to see happen based on things we've run into in the past. I'll say also, as I kind of have mentioned, we're also developing the autonomous vehicle testing framework. And that's really, it's not quite in parallel, but very similar in kind of where they are. And so it's been helpful to be able to think about both how the on-road, essentially robots work, and as well as the sidewalk side of that. And I'd say in all of this that we certainly view that standards are critical for program development. It gives operators greater certainty as to what they might run into and what they might be expected to behave like. But also for the city, we're not trying to just make a shot in the dark on our own. We're really relying on a larger group of people. And I'll say, for me, at least personally, this really came through when dockless bikes and scooters were first launching, and we were one of the early cities requiring data from the providers. We had one of the earlier programs stateside, and there were other cities that were faster and smarter than us in figuring out what exactly that data sharing should be. And over time, that's evolved with several, people having conversations on the side to actually being now the Open Mobility Foundation that runs mobility data specifications. So that's very specific. That's data from the devices about what they're doing, and some of the sharing from the city about what to do. But that baseline framing of understanding what is that data going to look like has given cities the ability to ask for better information and allowed the operators to stand up systems that could produce that data. And I can see that as the longer term, what's going on here with the standards in the space of public mobile robots. So I'll say our focus is really, we know we don't know all the challenges. We're hopefully going to be good for at least the near term and hopefully the medium term. But a lot of what Bern was talking about are things that we haven't fully grappled with yet, and are glad to have the Urban Robotics Foundation kind of leading this conversation in the ISO standards to give us that opportunity. So, other direction. You're good. I was ready for the next slide. Yep.
No, I know. I don't know what goes on, but are we there?
Yep. So, oops, back, there we go. So just to say, we had been thinking about some possible public sector use cases. I mentioned our legislation is really focused on commercial fleets, but we've been thinking these have a ton of opportunities for us, even just in the delivery structure that they're in, not even branching out into things that could do like sidewalk cleaning or bike lane plowing or something along those lines. So thinking about deliveries of food for those with limited mobility. Bern, yours was a great example. Will that robot carry someone's groceries home, bring them to them? We've thought about how can we replace existing fleet activities within the district. There are cars that bring books from the library to people in their homes. This is a great service, but could we do it with a robot? If we've got perhaps a senior who's able to get out of their home, but not necessarily go all the way to the library, possibilities. And one that we're really looking at right now is the ability to assist with our asset management. And we've got a project hopefully kicking off soon to test out their ability to help maintain our sign inventory, which the signs don't directly affect the robots, but the robots are in good position to potentially collect some of just the basic information about whether the sign is still there, possibly more about what it actually has on it. But we have a lot of assets to maintain. They're all our responsibility, and some of these require a lot from the community, often telling us that the sign is down, and if we can if we could leverage the robots to at least get some of the data, it would improve our ability to respond. So next slide. So just some basics of where we stand on things. I will say, so our regulations are in the works. They are moving through internal reviews, all the legal sufficiency, and will be out for public comment sometime later this year. So anybody who's following the space and is curious, I welcome your comments once they're publicly posted for commenting, to give us feedback on what could work better. So we're looking that they, as per largely guided by the legislation, they can operate in sidewalks and crosswalks, but not bicycle lanes or vehicular travel lanes. We've tried to write in a few exceptions, but we really can't find a way to get them past a point. Like a car is blocking the crosswalk, you might have to wander out into traffic, but hopefully not. They're not supposed to interfere with pedestrian or bicycle traffic. They have to be able to operate with or without an operator. As Bern mentioned, teleoperations are thus far certainly seem to be part of it, and they're not supposed to be staged or stored in public space unless we give them permission. So they can stand there while they're being loaded or unloaded very briefly, so they're waiting for the person to pick up the delivery out of them. But if they're just kind of hanging outside the store that they're supposed to work at, that's not where we want them. So next slide. So a bit of a snapshot on just the regulatory structure. I will say it's thin in a sense, and I'll get to that, but this is, like I said, this is more of a, we know this is probably not the long-term answer on some of these. So, but a lot of focus on the conditions for safety, weight, speed, visibility, maintenance, procedures of what to do in case of a failure. We think a lot also about special events here. Motorcades are not uncommon, knowing that the robot will stop when the police officer says, nope, no one's coming across this street until the presidential motorcade has gone past. But except they don't tell you it's the presidential motorcade, they just tell you to stop. And that part where everybody stopped is usually your clue. And then you just count how many cars are in the motorcade to guess how high up the official is that shut down traffic. But we are looking at data reporting, both on a recording basis, as well as for incidents, how we're going to be letting the public know that these will be out there. And then we will be hopefully requiring them to do an annual survey of shippers and receivers, as well as some presentations to our pedestrian advisory and multimodal accessibility advisory councils. We did want to consider the question of what happens if they fall over. What about special events? How quickly do they need to be removed off the street if they malfunction, or if we receive notice that there's some major event coming that, or some activity that really requires shutting down an area? Again, a lot of thoughts to kind of, if you're this close to the nation's capital, sometimes things happen quickly. There may be marches that are occurring and you need to kind of get the robots out of a zone just to make sure that they're not in the way or getting caught up in something. We also are capping the initial fleet and then setting a series of procedures for increasing that. And given where this industry is right now in terms of deliveries, this is where we chose to focus on adding in some equity components to thinking about how the robots might serve different needs. We opted not to require just a simple geographic distribution, which is often something we do with more broad-based deployments, such as, taxis have to serve the entire district. The scooter share programs have to serve the entire district. They have base requirements of being present in all areas of the city. In our case, we decided that it would be more important, and we'll see, this is all still TBD, but we're at least baseline proposing that they would need to be providing some base, potentially partnering up with either the government or the private sector to advance things. And then finally, if they break the rules, we can pull their permit or suspend it. So I think my last slide is up next. And just some things we're still considering. And I think that URF is certainly doing a lot of thinking and informing this on this. How do we define polite operations? Kind of, as Bern was talking about, the shy operations, how do we make sure they're not in the way? Is there ways to measure that? How does our sidewalk infrastructure interact, and what do we need to know about our sidewalks in order to successfully allow these programs to operate? And what happens if we start to end up with multiple fleets in an area? We're not necessarily expecting a lot of that at this moment, just given where the industry is and where they can link well to services, but it's certainly something we're aware of down the line. And the last one I just noticed, just another plug for URF, was we had a great conversation about whether the devices should make noise and what that should be. So Bern, I'll be excited to see your thoughts once we have that out. We had a good conversation with some researchers that have also been doing this for scooter share and what those devices need to do. So it's interesting to see, and I'm excited to see the space continue to evolve with the lessons that can be shared across the different devices and programs. So there's my contact information, and I know there's a bunch of questions in the chat, but Lee and Bern, let me know when you want to address those.
Well, before I hand it back over to Bern to introduce the municipal guide, there is a question that I think is timely. It's from Francisco that says, has your team considered revenue share? And this is for you, Stephanie. Has your team considered revenue share as part of the requirements for operating within the PROW?
Public right-of-way. We have not yet. There will be a permit fee associated with the devices. And I'm curious where this will go. I think it's one where we're waiting to see kind of how much activity we get and how they're doing. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm guessing I would probably need, I don't know if I can legally do that or if we need to change our legislation. Be curious to know if you are thinking about that, Francisco.
Yeah, Francisco.
The discussion has come up as part of our permitting requirements for our scooters and our e-bikes, and our community was so upset that we were charging or just letting scooters basically ride free, although they're making a lot of money using our public right-of-way. So we currently do have some delivery devices, but they're also operating just on a permit basis, not as a revenue share. I'm just considering whether our community is going to now take that anger that they have regarding scooters and kind of like transfer it over to the mobility devices, because they're also using the public right of way without any type of really, benefit, at least revenue share benefit to the community. So that's why I was just wondering if maybe that had come up in your discussions.
Well, that's a great segue to what Bern is going to be talking about, because one of the
Perfect.
6 pillars of deployment is monetization. So I'm going to hand it over to Bern now. And if you want to, pull up your next slide, you're ready to go. And then there are a couple more questions, but we'll answer those when Bern, you've wrapped up your section.
I just want, Stephanie, thank you so much for coming on today. I just want to point out to all of us, and to you, Stephanie, as well, it is so important that municipalities and the roboticists themselves are involved in this process of creating standards, because it's absolutely impossible to create standards in a vacuum without understanding all sides of the issue, the traffic issues, the monetization issues just mentioned, the planning and preparation issues, infrastructural issues, the control and congestion, all has to be considered. Otherwise, this won't work. This is a very, very new human experience to put machines without a human operator into the same space that humans are. We did that for a 20-year period back a century ago, where we mixed cars and horses and pedestrians all together at rather lowish speeds. And as soon as that car got quick, we separated car from pedestrians. And now we have all of this infrastructure that we have now for pedestrian infrastructure and automotive infrastructure. And now we're going to put devices, machines, into this pedestrian infrastructure. So again, this is a huge set of issues, and we need all parties. So just thank you, Stephanie, for coming on and telling us what you're up to. So I'm going to introduce. I don't know. I have 3 or 4 slides here to introduce the URF Municipal Guide to Public Area Mobile Robots. This and again, this is for all parties to be engaged in creation and use of this. All of our members are invited to review and comment on this guide, as well as they're invited to review and comment on the standards themselves. This guide is different from the standard in that it is organized in a stage-by-stage manner for cities to say, what do we do first? Then what do we do after that? And so forth. And so I'm going to describe the structure of this document. We have identified what we call 6 pillars of deployment. So if you're going to deploy public area mobile robots, you want to consider these 6 things. You want to consider a common set of behaviors. We want to consider a formal manner of traffic orchestration. So orchestration is like what we do at airports. The air traffic control systems that manage, your choice of runway and when you can land and all those sorts of things. We are doing this also for robots, and that addresses the congestion problem and how many we want in one place at one time problem, and how fast they can go in those places and so forth, because the sidewalks don't have what the roads have. The sidewalks have signs and lines and traffic lights, but our sidewalks don't. So how do we orchestrate the traffic as we do with automotive and air traffic? Municipal readiness is all the kinds of things that Stephanie was just talking about. Regulations, all the rules, the certification. Will you withdraw that will you withdraw a license if something goes wrong? How do you clean up if there's a problem? What are your rules for all that sort of thing? Fleet certification is another issue. Again, that's not a big deal when you have small fleets, but Stephanie hinted at some point we're going to have multiple fleets possibly in the same area. We're not there yet, but when we do, what does that mean? How do you, for the 5th one, how do you manage the behavior, traffic behavior? How do you enforce that? Without sounding alarming, do you know how to arrest a robot? If a robot is, so there's a fire truck with the siren on coming through an intersection, and the robot doesn't know to stop. How does any enforcement officer seize or halt or stop or capture or impound that robot? Do you have a method And are your staff trained to do those sorts of things? Hopefully that it's never needed, but look, things happen. So the city has to be prepared for that. And this last thing, and then Francesco just asked the same question, how are you going to monetize that? So these we believe are the 6 pillars. And what we do for each of those, what we do with each of those pillars is we take it through a series of stages. So there's a very initial discovery stage. DDoT passed that a couple of years ago when they first started looking at this. Now DDoT is in stage 2, and so is the city of Toronto, by the way. There's a half a dozen cities that are in this stage that are saying, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to govern this? Let's understand what this is up to. And during that time, before you exit that stage, really, really have to understand what you're going to do for accessibility. And accessibility, it's just the pedestrian comfort, but also wheelchair, blind, deaf. I showed you an example of a person that had mobility disability and so forth. So how do we make sure that all of those users are protected? Finally, you go into initial deployment. And the expectation is, as an example, DDoT's on its way to an initial deployment. These are fuzzy boundaries, but you're going to really gain serious experience at that point. Again, some while later, you will expand that deployment. That's where you get this question of like, what if we have multiple fleets in the same area, for example? Again, not there yet, but that's where you come. And then there's full deployment as well. So if you think about these pillars coming into each of these stages, that's 5 times 6, you end up with a part of this document. This is the guide. You end up with a part for each stage. That's the 5 stages, and a chapter within that part for each pillar. So there's 5 times 6. You end up with 30 chapters of one for each pillar at each stage. So that's what we're developing. I think I'll talk in a moment about when it will be released. The audience for this are the municipal leaders, such as many that are on this call, that are either making planning decisions or smart street decisions or infrastructure decisions, traffic decisions, traffic systems, and so forth. Planners and city builders, obviously, logistics, fleet operators, all the people that have a stakeholder that are stakeholders in this process. Interestingly, business improvement areas are probably, we think, are the next stage. So right now, most of these robots, the majority of them, delivery robots, are on city campuses, and the majority of surveillance robots are either in troubled areas or within buildings like airports and hospitals that might be doing surveillance activities, or sometimes they're on private property doing surveillance activities. But as they come out into cities, it's these business improvement areas that will be the next sort of domain for these robots to operate, for delivery and surveillance, and eventually maintenance. You see sidewalk maintenance, snow sweeping, and so forth. So these are all the reasons and purposes for the guidebook. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm missing a slide that says that the first edition is coming out in January 1st. And what I do want to tell you is that the focus of the first edition is on the first 2 stages. We're laying out the entire system, but the emphasis will be on the first 2 stages on the first publication. The book is republished each year, and as we gain more experience, more case studies, and more input from pilots and so forth, we will extend that detail into the later stages, like the full deployment and so forth. So I'm going to stop here and take any questions from anybody about anything. And by the way, if you have more questions for Stephanie, she's with us still, so ask those questions as well.
Thank you so much, Bern and Stephanie. And please feel free to use the raise your hand feature, and you can turn on your camera and sound if you wish to speak. Or but what I'll do is I'll start with the questions that were entered in the chat during the webinar. So I would say this is a question from Alex Curtis, and if you want to, again, you're welcome to Alex to come in and sort of ask some clarifying questions. But I believe this is for Stephanie, but I'm not actually sure that Stephanie there may be some other people on the call who might want to answer this as well, which is, have you considered mixed autonomy solutions such as robots with following technologies, brackets following a human leader tracked by, say, radar?
I can start. I'll just say, and I neglected to mention this at the start. I mentioned that pilot that we had, the pilot legislation. We did have one operator during that time frame. So we have had the PDDs on DC streets before. And in that case, these were not following robots, but they had minders that basically followed them around for most of that pilot stage, just because of they were still gaining confidence, I think, and familiarity. To the point that people still ask me, oh, is it the robots and are the binders going to be following them still? So they were aware that they were it helped, kept them from getting into trouble. I think we would be open, so long as it meets our requirements that we had for what it is, we would be open to it. It's just a question of whether somebody's got a version of this that they want. But Bern, I think you guys have probably thought about this a lot more than we have.
Can I just ask, Alex, did you want to add any clarifying questions or anything? I saw that you put your camera on.
Sure, yeah. I wanted to say also, I guess I'll just qualify. I work at a company called Piaggio Fast Forward, which creates basically kind of neat little robots that are like pedestrian robots that kind of follow humans and like mimic behavior, and they also carry things. So there's like applications for B2B kind of warehousing settings, but like the part that's relevant to this discussion is the pedestrian kind of follow me capabilities of this technology. This is embedded in a robot, which is called JITA. So, I mean, I also just wanted to say as an aside, this is not relevant to delivery per se, but there was an article published in Nature, the science journal, recently that involved a study with 17 of the robots of this company JITA, for the JITA robot. So it's focused on elderly people, and the kind of the conclusion of this. I'll just try to read this sentence here, and I'll try to tie it into what your discussion is about. So in conclusion, this study has demonstrated that human following robots have the potential to facilitate healthy aging and support better quality of life for older adults. So with this in mind, of like this kind of robotic technology having this sort of demonstrable effect on quality of life, we're hearing that now, like, how are you incorporating maybe findings like this about robotics into your overall planning for deploying, in this case, public mobile robots on the streets of DC?
I think that's one of the gaps in our regulations right now, is that it assumes a fleet as opposed to potentially a personally owned. And so it's a question I'm also curious about, because I think we'll start to see people wanting to have these. And it's a good question. Are they legal in our current framework? And then, because if they're not fully autonomous, but then how would we, I think we as a municipality would still, to what Bern was talking about with, fleet certifications, like if you were going to personally purchase one of these, would you then need to register it? Would it be something that the producing company would be required to request the permit and certify that the device met the requirements? We have started to think through some of this in our autonomous vehicle side, where we know that whoever's requesting permission to operate the fleet may not be the one that produced the vehicle. And so is it something then where whoever's requesting to operate has to have a certification from whoever created the device, really the autonomy portion of it, saying that yes, everything that's been, this device meets all the requirements, it can do all the things it's supposed to be doing, and in the way it's being deployed, this individual will be, as long as they follow this, use it in this way, it would be fine. I don't think we're structured right now to handle that, but I think we will probably have to grapple. That's one of those things I could have added to the considerations. I suspect we'll need to grapple with it in the nearer future, and I'm curious if other cities and states and provinces are like in a similar boat where their legislation was not written with this in mind, but are about to have to deal with the question.
Okay, great.
We do consider this in a standard, just to round out, like, what does the standard have to say about it? There's actually a part, the standard has 16 parts in it, and one of the parts is about follow me robots, but a follow me robot can be a personal robot's following a person. It's just this one person, they own that, and it follows them at a certain distance. But there's also follow me robots that can be used in work environments. So they might be following a worker carrying tools, or maybe carrying a garbage bin, and that person is cleaning or maintaining or something, and that device could be quite a bit larger than a suitcase. I mean, the ones, Alex, that you're talking about are sort of suitcase sized, personal sized, grocery sized. And, you know, I would own one and it would follow me as if you saw the picture of the woman earlier, but she was pulling a cart in her arm, in her hand. And if she were using your robot, it would just follow her at a short distance. All the standard says about that is that the municipality could say they're permitted or not. I mean, the municipality could be silent about them and not consider them, or you could ban them, or you could permit them, and then you could say things like it has to stay within a certain distance. So the standard provides for the municipality to say that the robot cannot be farther apart than so many meters from the person, because what the standard doesn't know what's possible. I mean, could a robot follow me from 100 meters? I mean, is that technically possible? It is. Is that desirable? No. What is the rule about that? Well, we don't have a rule about that. And that would be the kind of thing I would advise a city to say, if you're going to permit them, you say it needs to stay within a close proximity of the owner, because the owner is responsible for that. I think you can see those things. And there's a lot more detail than that, but the standard that does speak to that device.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so there's another question from Sandra, and I'm not sure actually if this is about the standard or if it's specifically for Stephanie. So it's her question, and Sandra, maybe you can clarify who it's for, but what's the size payload limit for what you consider a public area mobile robot? And Sandra says both. Her interest is both. So
ours does not actually contemplate a maximum payload or size, but because the devices are limited to 90 pounds, there is, to a certain extent, just an actual limit to what they're probably going to be able to carry, because it's hard to get them big. We do not allow them to carry like hazardous cargo. We do specify that, but that's all we've got right now. I'm curious to see what payloads we'll get.
okay, Bern, did you want to add anything?
Again, the standard doesn't say that the city should permit a particular speed. I mean, the standard does describe having them what we call in what we refer to as pedestrian speeds, which we think pedestrian speeds are somewhere between 3 and 6 kilometers per hour, depending on how fast your pedestrians are moving. But the standard doesn't demand that. The standard permits a way for the municipality to say, segment by segment, or block by block, or street segment by street segment, here's the speed on each one of these segments. So we actually provide a method for a map, so that, for example, Stephanie could say, in this area on these blocks, it can go at 4 kilometers per hour, and these other blocks can go 6 kilometers per hour. So the standard has a structure for that. But again, we don't say what those numbers have to be, because we already know of one city, I can't remember what it is, and it might be Toronto, that says you can go at a certain speed in this area, but this is an area where there's a lot of seniors, so you have to go at a much lower speed. And so the standard permits that kind of language and definitions. Basically, we want to make sure that the municipality has all the control it needs to manage its traffic and manage its behavior and manage its insurance load. That's those are.
Yeah, we have lots of questions in the chat. Yeah, I'm going to suggest that we continue to take as many as we can. If you have to drop off the call, I understand, but there's just so much interest, and I want to make sure that we take this opportunity to have both Bern and Stephanie answer them, if that's okay. I'm going to jump to a question from Jai Tampane, and it says, Bern, the regulations being considered are around making the robots safe for people. How far is the discussion about making the robots safe from people?
That's a good question. So the standard absolutely considers that. And one of the assumptions, well, first of all, it's actually part of the standard, and this isn't up to the municipality. The standard has to have a 360-degree view. The standard insists on that. If you're going to be compliant, you have a 360-degree view. And you have to be able to understand what's happening within that view to a certain distance on each side, to a certain distance forward and backward. Now, in that distance, we are concerned about something called blind spots, and this is all to do with vandalism. If you don't have a 360-degree view and a vandal understands that it can come up behind a robot and do something, then that can't be avoided or captured or understood. So we insist that the entire 360 view be available, and then we run into the problem of privacy. If something happens, does the owner of that robot that's been harmed by the vandalism have the recourse to use that data to press charges, for example? So the short answer is yes, it's in the standard. The long answer is, oh my God, there's privacy in data. There's a lot of issues that will have to be locally determined. So the standard can say, here's what you, to a municipality, here's what you can do when you license your fleet, make sure it has these properties, and consider data privacy if it has these properties. And then the municipality has to make a decision there, and that's based on their local laws about data privacy.
Wonderful.
Bern, yeah, thank you for the answer. I just want to add something else to it regarding the question itself. So there's been a video circulating on social media about a person taking their frustration out with CCTVs from all angles in broad daylight at a human like robot, because that robot was the only way to have appointments at a hospital. And that person obviously was not getting through. I mean, a fair reason, a very fair reason. Whether it's okay to damage property or not is a different thing. The frustration was real. The robot took a lot of damage. It's extremely unlikely that robots will ever have the same sort of rights that we enjoy. And it's practically impossible that robots will ever fight back with the way they will be programmed, with the way there will be safeties around them. It's not so much regulation about what the robot should do. It's more so around laws that will need to be done in parallel that consider the offense of hitting a robot and considering where is that offense on a gray scale between hitting a car versus hitting a person. Is that sort of the same level as a car, or is it a gray spot? Is it somewhere in the middle? And are the consequences of hitting a humanoid robot higher than that of just a normal object? And I guess that is one of the discussions where I was curious whether you know if that sort of discussion is also happening in the lawmaking side of things, rather than just the regulations around the robot.
Jai, I can't describe what's happening on the lawmaking side. The standard considers the robot a machine. So in other words, it's metal and plastic and software and hardware, and it's a machine that has the same, I mean, and somebody owns that, the company that owns that machine or the person that owns that machine, it's a piece of property. So we consider it that way. We don't consider it different than an automobile or whatever. But
Can I ask Stephanie?
We don't give it human status.
Yeah, Stephanie, do you have anything to add in terms of the legal framework?
I'm not sure. It was a good question. And it got me thinking, though, I mean, if we're issuing a public right-of-way occupancy permit, much in the same way that we would issue one to a sidewalk cafe, it's a transient occupation, right? That occupation of space moves. And so if someone were to damage someone's sidewalk cafe, what would be the impacts of that? I would assume that the robot would be handled in very similar fashion to a car. But the tricky part is that, when cars run into each other, they are usually required to be insured. Whereas a person doesn't carry that assumption of that interaction is not in the same way. So I think until someone does it. That said, these companies have some sense of what to do with it because they operate on like college campuses. And I would have to think that drunk college students would think that picking up a robot would be fun, at least some of them. So seeing what has happened in that space would probably be somewhat indicative of how that has been handled, if anything.
Vandalism is certainly part of the standard, and certainly something that the robot manufacturers are focused on, and they, their insurance, I'm sure, covers some of that as well. I'm going to jump to another question now from Abarazak. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's for Stephanie. You mentioned the need for sidewalk inspection data. I was wondering, what do you mean that the robot will inspect the road, or sorry, do you mean the robot will inspect the road, or will this info be shared by the operator transportation ministry database, or are these data standardized or not yet?
Yeah, so I think it's both ways. One is we are requesting that we're assuming that they're going to be needing to do some mapping. The ones that are teleoperated may need less initial mapping in order to successfully navigate an area. Anyone that is fully autonomous is we're expecting is likely to need some decent baseline mapping of the zone. Our sidewalk maps are not at a resolution that would allow for autonomous operations, at least in the way that autonomous vehicles on roadways currently require those maps. But we would like the sidewalk robots to tell us when they see stuff. So we do ask that. We have not standardized the format for that. We're interested. I should say that I should look at MDS 2.0 and check if there's anything about passing it back. But we're very interested in that component. It's just like a baseline for operating that if you're running down a sidewalk and you run into a condition that was not there yesterday or something blocking the sidewalk, please send us an alert. And that is meant, I think down the line, we'd like to see that come into a standardized format. I don't think there's, as far as I'm aware, is a strong standard in the space of what exactly sidewalk infrastructure and condition look like. But we're still working on it in a sense in the roadway space as well. We know exactly where the lines are, but actually conveying the nuances of it. Sidewalks are just different than roads. That would be my take. But if there's a standard out there, please tell me. And I will happily look at adopting.
There isn't yet. There's methods out there. A few companies have methods, but they're not standardized. But what our standard calls for is that the fleet operators can exchange that data into a master map, but there's no standard for the master map yet, which is what you're referring to.
Great. We have two final questions. I hope I haven't missed anybody, but this is from Swati Panwar at the City of Toronto. How equitable are these robots in terms of their deployment and accessibility? In what neighborhoods will they operate? And how affordable are they? And that's sort of, I guess, three, but this phrase is one, but three questions. And then where are the robots tested to handle unplanned situations and challenges?
To the first one, we spent a little while thinking about this. I kind of touched on the fleet increase size is where we decided to build that in. Our understanding, at least right now from operators, is that they need to not wander too far from their home bases, which makes sense because they're moving at essentially pedestrian speeds. And so even when they find an open sidewalk, if you get moving at like the full maximum 10 miles per hour, which would be a rapid clip down the sidewalk. It's what the scooters in the district are limited to as well. You're still going to have to pause at every intersection. And we have a very arterial network. It's dense. So we don't think they're going to wander too far from wherever their source of the goods that they're delivering are, which changed our perception of where we might want them. We also didn't want to just universally require them to serve everything, because we know there's some areas where the sidewalk might not be a good fit for them. And so it's a little bit then of waiting to see what requests we get and then kind of assessing the infrastructure in parallel with the use cases. But if they're probably, at least in their commercial uses, going to largely be tied to commercial corridors where the businesses are located, it gives you a sense of where you're going to see them. It does raise equity questions because some of our lower income neighborhoods are actually underserved in terms of things like groceries and other goods and services, but the bots are not going to fix that problem necessarily. I think there are probably broader solutions that we need to look at, or we certainly do need to look at, but we're not viewing this as some sort of panacea. And so that was where our fleet increase requirement was actually looking at the types of goods that they're delivering and the types of partnerships they're engaging in, rather than specifying the type. We do also have an option where if a certain percentage of the deliveries have been made within lower income or areas of greatest transportation need, which has to do with both what the transportation network provides and the communities that are impacted. So based on income, race, disability, and language. So kind of more historically disadvantaged populations and lower access components put together, then if you have a higher share of your deliveries in that zone, then we would consider a fleet increase for you just because we think that you're meeting at least some baseline threshold for equity components. But we weren't sure we wanted to start with the initial use cases requiring a strong component there, just partly in not trying to force it into a place where it might not be the best fit, just so that they could get the permit. Let them kind of test out with a proven what they really think is their best use case, and then make them broaden from there. And then test it to handle the unplanned situations and challenges. Good question. I think I'll be asking it as the permits come in. We don't have any requirements on the robot side right now. We are looking at that on the autonomous vehicles for on-road operation. We will be asking, where have you tested in similar circumstances?
I think some of our robot members may want to address that question rather than Stephanie or Bern. But Bern, did you have anything else you wanted to add for Swati's question?
Well, we have the standard only answers that partially. The standard provides a list of testing concerns, like make sure you test these kinds of things. It doesn't say how to go about it or how thorough those tests should be, because there are other test regimes or test standards that we point to, but we haven't designed specialized tests. So that's a tough problem, because I think everybody understands that the definition of an edge case is something you wouldn't have anticipated until you see it. It's the
Right.
kind of things, oh, we hadn't thought of that. So if you're gonna, how do you write tests for all the things you haven't thought of? You can't. So by definition, it's a very difficult problem.
Well, and some of that comes with experience, which is why that we have the 5 different maturity stages and
Thank you. Exactly.
the case studies. So we're not expecting every pilot studies to succeed. So some of that testing actually happens. And then this is a lovely comment from Stephanie. If you want to partner up on figuring out how to test these, let me know, says Stephanie. So what a great note on which to end our webinar today. Thank you everybody for attending. And Stephanie or Bern, any closing comments?
No, thank you. Thanks everybody for your time. And it's good news that several of you were willing to stay over for a few minutes. Very, very interesting and complex questions being looked at. So thank all of you.
Thank you, everybody.